Hello there. Welcome back to another day where I have some free time. And here in the new episode of nobita.h, we will do this part of the to-do list where we will rebuild the files based on their last mod times so that when executing the build file, for example, it does not need to rerun these compile commands as the final executable already exists. So we will be tackling this. Let's see. So how can we go about this? Since we'll be checking the file status, so I guess it should be called fstat in the standard library. And yes, it is. And we need to include this one. Though I have some problem with this, since I don't really want to deal with having to open the file first with open and giving the file descriptor here. So instead of fstat, since we need to use open first and get the file description, we can use just stat. That would take the file path and a buffer it where it can put the file status in. So let's take this. And I think the struct for stat already in systypes on this line. If I remember correctly. Yes, it is. Oh no, it is in systat itself, surprisingly. So now we can compare the object file to the source file. Since we can just check if an object file has been rebuilt and we can decide if we need to rerun the command to link it all back to an executable or a library. So we can just add another function here where it will return. Supposedly, I wanted it to be a boolean by checking is a newer, where the file path A is the source file and file path B is the object file. And we can just use stat stat by calling the stat function. So just rename just name it as A and as B. But if stat fails, which it can actually, wait a minute. do I need to check the other one? And 3 stat. There you go. It would return -1 if there's an error. And mm, it says no, but I don't really want to use p-error to print the error message yet, since the proper error handling shall be handled later. So we can just set these to 0 first. So that if the if using stat on the object file fails, then it will still result in the source file being newer than, well, nothing. So that's that. I'll do the same for the source file as well, or the supposed place for the source file, just in case. And then we can finally call stat normally on A, and the buffer and the respective buffers. Then what we'll return is that I have not actually read the manual page properly for the members of the stat struct, but I think it's called modification time in here as well. Yes, time of last modification. So what we want is that A should be newer. So we should check A first, and its M time. If it's greater than uh, SB, and that's it. Now instead of calling build object directly, we can oops, just call build object if it does not return true, if the is a newer function does not return true. The file, the A file should be the object file, and B should be the source. So when this returns false, the source file is newer than the object and we need to rebuild the object. And then we can set a flag here that we need to relink or something. And the moment that happens, we need to go through here. And if relink is still false, then we can just return from this function. I think that's it. All right, let's try rebuilding this. And of course, I forgot to use ASAN for some safety. And let us run this. There you go. It did not rebuild hello. But the problem with this is just that if hello or the final executable does not exist, but it does not need to rebuild the object files, of course, it will not rebuild anything. But if I remove the object file here, I think it will rebuild it. Yes, it did. So the problem is that if the executable does not exist, then it would not rebuild it unless the object file has also been rebuilt. That's the problem with this logic. So what we need to do is that we need to check if stat actually succeeds with actually getting the status of the file, which should be easy for now. That's just checking the name and putting the result in this exe struct. But stat needs to not return -1. So let us try to recompile this again. Remove hello. Let's see if while it does not let's see if it does not rebuild the object file, but it relinks the executable. Yes, it does. But what if I just remove the object file? Will it relink the final executable? Since that is the correct course of action, as the object file would indeed be newer than the executable. And yes, it did. So that's the to-do complete. Now, I want to add another to-do here, which is it's a pain to have to recompile this build executable every time I add a new feature, so I want it to rebuild itself if either the object file, no, not the object file, if its source file and the Nobita header file is newer than the build executable. So rebuild itself if its sources are newer. Build exe, the build file, if its sources are newer. So it's the rebuild yourself technology by that I saw in Solding's no build. We will implement that here as well. So we'll be tackling down two to-dos here, and hopefully it won't take as long. Oops, wrong file. But I want to give the user the choice whether he wants to rebuild it or not. So should be in here. Void nobita rebuild. The problem is I do not exactly know what is the name of the source file of the build executable. And to be honest, uh, the user itself can just specify it. So let him specify it. Here in rebuild. Maybe that is not the correct term. Maybe just try rebuild. Still though, we'll be doing this normally just after here, since it needs is a newer function. And here in the build uh, strat, it needs to have argc and argv. Since the build executable can be found as the first argument in any C program, from main, instead of not accepting any arguments, we just copy it over and in rebuild we can get the executable build exe, and that is the first argument here. The build file is already specified, and nobita here should be in the macro file, as you can see here, the header. And then we can check if uh, if the source is newer, say the build executable, no, the build file against the build executable, oops, and if the header is newer than the build executable, it would have to rebuild. But we can negate this argument with the exclamation mark, since if none of the files, the source files, are newer than the executable, then this function should do nothing. So should return from here. Yeah, that's fine if it's not a constant. But if it does not return, then we need to create the build commands. We can just copy the ones from build.exe, or maybe not. We can just create our own. Struct target e, and we need to initialize its full command. Of course, we have to free it too. And once more, I forget that this takes an address. But how do we know what compiler is used to build this build.exe, to create this build.exe? Let's see. We, we can check if the, what was it again? Was it declaring? Yes, it was declaring macro. If that is defined, then the compiler is definitely um of course Clang. And if what's defined is Gnusi, I think that's how that goes, then it should be GCC. And if it's not, I just hope that you have an executable in path called CC that is already symlinked to your executable compiler of choice, not executable. Well, technically it is. And the arguments that I want for this is, well, I want to have all warnings and extra warnings, pedantic warnings, and max optimizations with debug information. Next up, the output option, which should be the build file. Wait, where is it? It was correct that it was a build.exe though, with the arguments of the actual build file. I think that is it. And we can just append null here. And since none of these were actually manually allocated, except for the build file somehow, that is passed on by the user. That is not my problem. We can just fork exec from here with e.fullcmd and hope for the best that it actually rebuilds itself. After that, we need to reset full command back to 0, the use, and actually rerun itself via the argc that has been copied here, and argv. So we can append that here. Append e full command and argv. So it will rerun itself. But before that, it needs to have null here and another fork exec. I guess I should also add a flag in Nobita build so that does not try to rebuild stuff again as itself has already been as the build file itself has already been rebuilt. So let's just call it was self rebuild. Should be set to false. Though if itself was not revealed, then it can call the build.exe routine. But if this somehow becomes true, which the rebuild function will do, then the original executable that rebuilt itself will just exit after freeing the arrays. That is kind of a bad explanation. So we can try to explain it with some drawings. So the thing is that, say, this is the process for nobita.exe. No, not exe. The main build file. But if its sources are newer, then it will launch a compile command to rebuild itself. Say cc. Oh my. After that, this would finish and then it would rerun itself. So the main build file B will rerun itself, create another process that runs itself. Then this will launch the other compile commands that will build the executables and libraries, but no libraries in here yet. After that, this would exit normally, but this would still try after that to run the compile commands. And we don't want to waste our time with that. So we just set this flag here to true, and this shall not be executed. So let us try it. Maybe something went wrong. First, we need to compile it with that feature on, and then run. And if we change this file's modification time, the header, then run this. Huh, surprisingly, it does not do a thing. That is because of my previous statement where I want the user itself to decide if he wants the build file to rebuild itself. Man, how confusing. So let us add that feature here. You shall rebuild yourself. But how can we get the build file here? Well, we can just use the file macro again. But the reason why can't I just use the file macro on the header, since that file macro would actually point to the header itself and not this build file. Now let us compile it with that feature. Of course, it would not rebuild, but if we rewritten the build file, then run the build executable. Now that is undefined behavior. Okay, what did I mess up? So first, it would check if the build file is newer, and if it's not, no, this should be ended, I think, since the executable and the build executable needs to be newer than both the header and the build source, sorry. So we can just reverse this and not have any problems, and remove the negation here. There you go. Now it recompiled itself. But why? Where non-null is expected. I guess we really need to check here. Though we screwed up in here. Since this will return false if actually malloc succeeded and killed the program. But it is rerunning itself though. Again, where are we going with here? 234. I screwed up the assert that once more. How about now? There you go. Now it rebuilt itself. But how about now? It does nothing. And if I change the source, say resaved it again. There you go. Now rebuilds itself and the rules that have been set in the build file. I guess we're done for now. And we have to set that in the to-do list. I guess that's taken way longer than expected. But thank you for sticking with me this far. And thank you for watching. And but for the next video, I guess we will try to add the libraries and the prefix directory. Again, in this video, thank you for watching.